My parents laughed at me over dinner. Still riding the bus, aren't you? I rose and smirked, strange. My chauffeur's been outside in the rolls for an hour. The room fell silent as Mom asked, rolls? What rolls? You know that feeling when you've been pushed too far, when the quiet resentment inside you finally boils over. For me, it wasn't a single fight. It was a lifetime of being told I wasn't enough, of being the family joke. But one night, in a fancy restaurant, I finally delivered the punchline they never saw coming, and it wiped the smiles right off their faces. Want to know what happened next? For as long as I can remember, my name is Carl, and I've been 29, the punching bag of my family. Not physically, no, but in that insidious way where every family dinner, every holiday, every single gathering somehow revolved around jokes made at my expense. My parents, they had this unique talent for disguising pure cruelty as just teasing. My older brother, Mark, he was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. My younger sister, Rachel, the delicate flower perpetually in need of more attention. And me? I was the one who was supposed to toughen up, to laugh along, to happily accept the role they'd carved out for me from birth. For years, I did exactly that. I let their jabs roll off my shoulders, pasted on a practiced smile through the digs about my cheap clothes or my tiny apartment. I pretended their laughter didn't sting. But beneath that forced grin, a silent rage was building inside me, like steam in a kettle about to explode. Our family dynamic was a broken record, always the same tune. My dad, a finance man through and through, measured worth by luxury cars, sprawling houses, and bulging bank accounts. My mom, the quintessential hostess, tirelessly reminded us that appearances were, in fact, everything. Mark, of course, followed directly in my dad's footsteps, climbing the corporate ladder with his chest puffed out like a peacock. Rachel, on the other hand, leaned into being the perpetual child, no matter how old she got, demanding endless attention and resources. When I chose a different path, starting my own small business instead of joining the corporate rat race, they didn't just disapprove. They outright laughed. They said it was cute that I wanted to play entrepreneur. Whenever I even dared to mention my work, the room would fall silent for a beat, a heavy, suffocating silence. Then, someone would casually change the subject, as if my efforts weren't even worth acknowledging. That silence, let me tell you, it cut deeper than any joke ever could. I'll never forget one particular dinner a few years back. I showed up straight from a long, exhausting day at work. My car had broken down the week before, so I'd been taking the bus everywhere, trudging through rain and shine. I was tired, yeah, but I was also incredibly proud. I'd just closed my first major deal, one that would literally keep my tiny business afloat for the entire next year. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd ask how I was doing. Offer me the smallest shred of encouragement. Instead, my dad raised his glass, a familiar smirk playing on his lips. Here's to Mark's new promotion. Meanwhile, Carl's still riding public transport. Don't worry, son, he'd scoffed, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. Someday, you'll make enough for a used car. Everyone laughed. Even Rachel, who had no job at the time, giggled behind her hand. I remember forcing a pathetic chuckle, nodding along, trying to disappear. But inside, I felt like I was shrinking, fading away. That night, lying wide awake in my cramped apartment, I made myself a promise. A silent, ironclad vow. I wouldn't let them see me break. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of being right about me. I would work harder, smarter, and quietly build something so monumental they couldn't possibly laugh it off. I wasn't chasing their approval anymore. I was chasing the look on their faces when they finally realized just how badly they'd underestimated me. That thought became my fuel. Every long day, every gut-wrenching setback, every moment of self-doubt, I replayed that dinner in my mind. Their laughter echoed, and I transmuted it into pure, unadulterated drive. Fast forward a few years, and things had changed. Slowly at first, then all at once, my business absolutely exploded. What began as a tiny consulting service morphed into a thriving firm with major clients, international accounts, and enough revenue to not just survive, but truly thrive. I reinvested everything back into the business, living modestly for a long time as I expanded. But eventually, I reached a point where success wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It was tangible. The kind of success you could touch, drive, and walk into. I bought a house. A beautiful one. And then, I bought a car. Not just any car, a Rolls-Royce. My dream vehicle. The kind of car my dad used to point out in magazines and declare, now that's a real man's car. I remember sitting in it for the very first time, my hands on the steering wheel and thinking, I wish they could see this. Not out of a need for validation anymore, but because I wanted them to choke on their own words. So, when I got the call from Mom last month, inviting me to another family dinner, I already had an idea forming in the back of my mind. She played it off casually, saying it had been too long, that we should all catch up like old times. But her tone, I knew it too well, it gave it all away. There was always a motive. Maybe Mark had another new promotion they wanted to gloat about. Maybe Rachel had some fresh drama they needed to drag me into. Either way, I knew how it would go. I'd sit there, listen to them brag, then take the usual jabs about how I was still the odd one out. Except this time, things were profoundly different. This time, I had something they didn't know about, and I was more than ready to let it slip. The night of the dinner, I dressed simply. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth. Just a clean button-up and slacks. I called my driver, yes, my driver, and told him to wait outside the restaurant in the rolls until I gave the signal. Walking inside, I already felt that old, familiar tension creeping in, like stepping back into a role I'd completely outgrown, but couldn't quite escape. The hostess led me to the table where my family sat, their laughter spilling out even before I reached them. Dad was mid-story, Mark nodding like a mirror image of him, and Rachel was sipping wine with that smug little smile she perfected. When they saw me, the greetings were warm on the surface, but underneath, it was the same condescending familiarity I'd grown up with. Dinner went exactly as expected at first. Stories about Mark's latest big deal at work. Exaggerated complaints about Rachel's busy schedule, which, from what I could tell, still mostly consisted of shopping and social events funded by Dad. Then came the inevitable turn toward me. Dad leaned back in his chair, that smirk I knew so well, tugging at his mouth. So, Carl, he began, loud enough for surrounding tables to hear, still taking the bus these days? Mark chuckled. Rachel covered her smile with her hand. And Mom gave a pitying sigh, like she was embarrassed for me. It was all so familiar. The setup, the punchline, the laughter at my expense. But this time, I felt something entirely different. I didn't shrink. I didn't force a laugh. Instead, I stood up slowly, deliberately placed my napkin on the table, and let a calm, unhurried smile spread across my face. Funny, I said, my voice quiet but steady, cutting through their fading laughter. My driver's been waiting outside in the rolls for an hour. The laughter died instantly. Forks froze midair. Mark's smug smile completely faltered. Rachel's eyes widened like saucers, and Dad's face twitched, as if he wasn't sure he'd heard me right. Mom was the first to break the heavy silence, her voice barely above a whisper. Rolls? What rolls? The weight of that moment hung over the table like a storm about to break. And that's where everything shifted. The silence after my words felt so incredibly heavy, like the entire restaurant had leaned in, holding its breath to hear what would happen next. My mom's voice, soft and shaky, still echoed in my head. Rolls? What rolls? Her fork rested, forgotten, on her plate, her eyes darting toward my dad as if he'd have an explanation, as if he could wave away what I'd just said with some clever quip. But Dad didn't speak. He just stared at me, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line, the same way he used to look when I messed up as a kid, and he was deciding whether to lecture me or just ignore me. Mark shifted in his chair, uncomfortable, and Rachel bit her lip, suppressing a laugh, but it was nervous, like she didn't know which way this was going to swing. I sat back down slowly, letting my calmness settle over them like a blanket. I didn't need to explain myself. Not yet. The beauty of the moment was letting them stew in it, letting them realize that for once, they absolutely did not have the upper hand. And yet, true to form, Dad wasn't about to let me have the spotlight, even unintentionally. He cleared his throat, forcing a smirk back onto his face. Carl, don't exaggerate. Rolls? What, are you test driving one from the dealership? I've read about people doing that, pretending for a night. It's not the same as actually owning one. His words dripped with condescension, like he was throwing me a rope out of embarrassment, but in reality, he was trying to yank me back down to where they thought I belonged. Mark jumped in, his voice smooth, but undeniably smug. Yeah, I mean, it's fine, Carl. We all embellish things sometimes. It's like when Rachel said she was going vegan for a month, but still snuck chicken nuggets. No shame in it, but let's keep it realistic, okay? His laugh was forced, but he tried to make it seem good-natured, like he was being the understanding older brother. Rachel, emboldened by Mark's tone, chimed in next. Honestly, Carl, it's just you've always been kind of dramatic about things. Remember when you got that tiny bonus at your old job and you acted like you'd won the lottery? I mean, a rolls. That's just not you. She smiled sweetly, but her words were sharp, meant to slice through whatever confidence I'd gathered. The three of them laughed, not as loudly as before, but enough to try to drown out what I had said, enough to turn it into another family joke. My mom shook her head slowly, sighing in that deeply disappointed way she had perfected. We just want you to be grounded, Carl. We don't want you to build castles in the sky and then crash down when reality hits. It's hard enough watching you struggle without having to sit through this sort of fantasy. Her words stung more than the outright mocking, because that was her trick. She made cruelty sound like care, like she was doing me a favor by cutting me down, keeping me realistic. And in the past, I'd accepted it. I'd taken the comments quietly, tucked them away, and told myself I'd prove them wrong one day. But now, sitting there with their smug faces around me, I realized something. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I already had. Still, I wasn't ready to show my hand. Not yet. Instead, I leaned back, giving them a small smile. The kind that was enough to make them uneasy, but not enough to confirm anything. Sure, I said simply, letting my words hang in the air. Maybe you're right. For a moment, they seemed relieved, as if I was retreating back into the role they expected of me. But inside, my heart was pounding, not with fear, but with anticipation, because I knew what they didn't. Outside, under the glow of the streetlights, sat the proof they couldn't deny. The Rolls wasn't a fantasy. It wasn't a loaner or a rental. It was mine, paid for in full. And when the moment came, they would see it with their own eyes. But instead of savoring dinner together like a family, the conversation only spiraled further into the old, toxic patterns. Dad launched into a story about how Mark had been headhunted by another firm, how recruiters were practically begging him to join. That's what success looks like, Carl, Dad said pointedly, when people recognize your worth and chase after you, not when you chase after clients, scrambling to make ends meet. Rachel sighed dramatically, talking about how stressed she was planning her networking trip to Paris. She hadn't paid for it, of course, Dad was covering it all, but she framed it like she was an overworked businesswoman in desperate need of rest. Mom nodded along, patting her hand, cooing about how Rachel deserved it after all the pressure she was under. Meanwhile, I sat there, my plate barely touched, listening to them pile praise on each other while seamlessly slipping in jabs at me. They didn't ask about my business. They didn't care. To them, I was still the same Carl who'd shown up years ago, tired from taking the bus, trying to talk about a deal they couldn't be bothered to acknowledge. To them, nothing had changed. But they were wrong. And soon, very soon, I'd make sure they knew just how wrong. And that's when Dad leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, and asked the question that set the next part of the night into motion. So, tell us, Carl, if this Rolls is real, why don't we see it for ourselves? Or are you afraid it might suddenly disappear? He said it with a chuckle, but I could feel the challenge in his words, the bait he was dangling, and I already knew exactly how I was going to answer. Dad's words hung in the air, a challenge disguised as humor, but I could feel the sharp undercurrent of malice. Why don't we see it for ourselves, he'd said, his chuckle forced, his eyes daring me to either back down or double down. I could have laughed it off, brushed past it, but before I even opened my mouth, Mom's voice cut through the tension. Actually, she said smoothly, leaning forward with that deceptively warm smile she used when she was about to twist the knife. Maybe we should see. It would be good for Carl to clear the air, put an end to these stories before they get too big. She glanced around the table, and her tone changed ever so slightly, as though she were talking to the others, but deliberately loud enough for me to hear. I'd hate for him to embarrass himself like he used to. Remember the time he swore he was getting a promotion, and it turned out he was laid off? Laughter followed instantly. Mark smirked. Rachel laughed outright. Even Dad cracked a smile. And I just sat there, frozen in my chair. That moment, Mom dragging up one of the hardest, most humiliating times in my life and parading it as a dinner anecdote, hit me in a way their mockery hadn't in years. It wasn't teasing anymore. It wasn't just a jab. It was betrayal, plain and sharp. She knew how hard I'd fought after losing that job, how I'd clawed my way into building something of my own. And yet here she was, weaponizing that failure as entertainment. Mark raised his glass, grinning. Oh yeah, how could we forget Carl the Dreamer? Always talking big, always crashing harder. He clinked his glass against Dad's. But hey, at least it makes for good stories, right? Rachel chimed in, unable to resist. Or when he showed up to Christmas with that thrift store sweater and called it vintage. She snorted into her wine. We should start writing these down. Carl's greatest hits. It wasn't just their words. It was the way they looked at me, like I wasn't an equal at that table, like I was the entertainment, the clown who existed to make them feel better about themselves. I could feel my fists clenching under the table, nails biting into my palms. Part of me wanted to stand up, shout, walk out, leave them to their smug little world. But another part of me knew better. This wasn't the time to storm off. This was the time to listen, to let them think they'd won, because the higher they climbed on their tower of arrogance, the harder the fall would be. Still, in that moment, it hurt. I couldn't deny it. Sitting there, mocked by the very people who were supposed to be my family, dredging up old scars and laughing at the blood, I felt something inside me harden. Whatever fragile hope I had left, that maybe one day they'd see me differently, maybe one day they'd accept me, shattered. That night, they made it crystal clear. They didn't want to understand me. They didn't want me to succeed. They wanted me small, dependent, and ashamed. And then, as if the universe was testing just how much more I could take, Dad leaned forward again. His voice was quieter now, but it carried an edge I'd never heard before. You know, Carl, if this business of yours is real, maybe it's time you finally started giving back. Mark's been carrying more than his share, and Rachel has her needs. You could step up for once. Help out your family. I blinked at him, stunned. It wasn't just mockery anymore. It was a demand. A demand wrapped in guilt. As though everything I'd endured up to that point was suddenly erased. And now I owed them. They hadn't supported me when I was scraping by. Hadn't even believed in me when I started out. But the second they caught the faintest whiff that I might actually have something, it wasn't pride or encouragement I saw in their eyes. It was hunger. Mom nodded along, her hand brushing against Rachel's. Exactly. You know how expensive her Paris trip is. And Mark has been so generous, always helping us out. It wouldn't hurt to ease the burden, Carl. That's what families do. Rachel set her glass down, giving me the sweetest smile she could muster. It would mean a lot, Carl. You've always wanted to be included, right? This is your chance. For a moment, my throat tightened. They weren't just mocking me. They were circling me like vultures. I realized then what I hadn't wanted to admit. They didn't see me as family. They saw me as a resource, something to exploit once I became useful. That was the moment everything changed. The betrayal wasn't just their laughter or their stories at my expense. It was their intent. They didn't want me to succeed for me. They wanted me to succeed for them so they could carve up the pieces and call it support. And as I sat there, forcing myself to stay calm while their voices droned on about how helping out was the least I could do, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. This wasn't going to end with me giving them what they wanted. It was going to end with them seeing just how badly they had underestimated me. I left that dinner feeling hollow, like someone had scooped me out from the inside and left nothing but a shell walking toward the door. Their words followed me, sticking to my skin like smoke, always talking big. Step up for once. Help out your family. They rang in my ears with every step I took away from the restaurant. When I got outside, the Rolls was there, gleaming under the streetlights, the driver standing by, ready to open the door. For a second, I thought about signaling him, making a scene, letting my parents and siblings see the proof of everything I'd built. But I stopped myself. Not yet. Walking past the glass windows, I could see their silhouettes still sitting around the table, laughing like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just been gutted in front of them. My hand tightened on the car door handle, and I whispered under my breath, "Not yet. You'll see soon enough." Then I slid inside. That night, lying in my bed, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me. I thought about every moment I had sat quietly while they mocked me. Every time I had swallowed my pride, telling myself one day it would be different, but it never was. I had been waiting for them to change, for them to finally see me as more than the family joke, but they never would. And the realization hit me harder than their laughter. Nothing I did, no amount of success, would ever earn me the acceptance I'd once wanted so badly. The pain of that truth cut deep. For years, I had fueled myself on the idea of proving them wrong. And now, even with everything I had, even with the life most people would envy, I still felt small in that restaurant chair because I'd been chasing the wrong thing all along. I didn't need them to approve of me. I needed to accept that their approval had never mattered in the first place. But that didn't mean I was going to let them walk all over me again. No, if they wanted to paint me as the failure, the dreamer, the broke one, they were about to find out how wrong they were. Still, revenge wasn't something I could rush. If I acted too fast, it would look like defensiveness, desperation. I needed patience, timing, precision. So, I started planning quietly in ways they wouldn't see coming. The first step was distancing myself. When Mom texted me the following week with a reminder about Rachel's Paris trip, I didn't respond. When Dad called asking if I could contribute something toward family expenses, I let it ring. When Mark emailed me a thinly veiled pitch about investing in one of his side ventures, I didn't even open the attachment. I went silent. The silence drove them crazy. They weren't used to me withholding, weren't used to me not playing the role they'd assigned me. For the first time, I wasn't accessible, wasn't available to be their punching bag or their wallet. And though the loneliness was real, because a part of me still longed for a family that didn't exist, I could feel a quiet strength building inside me. Still, it wasn't easy. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was wrong, wondering if maybe I should. Just give in, give them something, and maybe the pressure would ease. Maybe the mocking would stop. Maybe they'd let me in, even if it was only because of what I could provide. But then I'd remember Mom's smile as she dragged up my lowest moment. Dad's tone when he demanded I start giving back. Rachel's saccharine little, it would mean a lot, Carl. And the ache in my chest would harden into resolve again. I was done begging for scraps of their respect. If they wouldn't give it freely, I'd take it by force, by showing them in a way they couldn't ignore that I wasn't the one who needed them. They were the ones who needed me. And as I quietly pulled back, letting them stew in confusion, the pieces of my plan began to form. I wouldn't lash out in anger. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. No, I would wait. I would build. And when the moment came, I'd turn the very things they mocked me for into the weapons of their undoing. The rock bottom wasn't just their betrayal at that dinner. The real rock bottom was the quiet acceptance that my family would never be the family I wanted. And the rise from that pit wouldn't be about them anymore. It would be about me reclaiming the power I'd given away for far too long. It was only a matter of time. The weeks that followed felt strangely quiet. For the first time in years, I wasn't tethered to the constant tug-of-war with my family. No answering texts that dripped with manipulation. No forced smiles at dinners where I was the butt of the joke. No hollow, maybe next time, excuses when they dangled invitations to events they knew I couldn't afford. I had stepped back completely. And in that silence, I found space to breathe. And in that breathing space, something shifted. My work took on a new rhythm. Without the weight of their voices echoing in my head, I poured myself fully into my business. Clients who had once seemed out of reach suddenly weren't. Deals I had been hesitant to chase now felt within my grasp. It was as if cutting out the poison had cleared my vision. And for the first time, I could see just how much I was truly capable of. Within 6 months, my firm doubled in size, then tripled. We landed a partnership with a major international company, something that sent ripples through my entire industry. Calls poured in. Invitations to conferences, keynote speeches, panels. My calendar filled faster than I could keep up. The long hours that once felt grueling now felt like momentum, like a wave I was finally riding instead of fighting against. And with that success came choices I'd never had before. The roles was just the beginning. I bought a penthouse overlooking the city, glass walls that let me watch the skyline at night like it belonged to me. I traveled London, Tokyo, Sydney, not for show, but because my work and my life demanded it. The boy who used to ride the bus, clutching his worn backpack while rehearsing excuses for why he couldn't join his family's expensive outings, now had access to the world. And with each step forward, the old insecurities slipped further away. But here's the thing. I didn't flaunt it. Not publicly, not yet. I didn't plaster my success all over social media. I didn't call home with updates. I let them think whatever they wanted to think. Because I knew, sooner or later, curiosity would eat at them. Their silence wasn't concern. It was calculation. If they weren't asking questions yet, it was because they were waiting for the right moment to circle back. And eventually, they did. It started with Mom. A casual message as if we hadn't gone months without speaking. Carl, honey, how have you been? We miss you. Maybe you could come by for dinner. Just like old times. I read it 3 times before setting my phone down, smiling faintly. Old times. As if those dinners had been anything more than stages for my humiliation. I didn't reply. Then Rachel reached out, sending me pictures from Paris with captions like, "Wish you could have been here," followed by the way, do you know a good way to transfer large amounts of money internationally? Asking for a friend, subtle as a brick. I didn't answer. Finally, Mark called. He didn't even try for small talk. "Look, Carl, I know we've given you a hard time in the past, but you know, it's all love, right? Family's family." Anyway, I've got this new investment opportunity you might be interested in. Huge returns. If you want to finally get in on something big, now's the time. I hung up before he finished his pitch. The silence I gave them wasn't just distance anymore. It was control. For years, I had been the one waiting for scraps, waiting for them to acknowledge me. Now, the tables had turned, and they didn't even realize it. They were the ones waiting, circling, probing for an opening. And I wasn't giving them one. Not yet. Instead, I focused on building something even stronger. My firm wasn't just profitable. It was becoming influential. We weren't just taking clients. We were shaping markets. I hired a team I trusted. People who respected me, not because of my last name or because they had to, but because of what I could create. That respect, that loyalty, it was worth more than any hollow approval my family had ever withheld. And quietly, I began positioning myself for the moment I knew was coming. The moment they would demand proof, the moment their curiosity would crack open into desperation. I kept the roles, yes, but I also bought something subtler. A fleet of black sedans for my team. A driver service under my name. I invested in property, not just for myself, but for the firm. Offices in 3 cities, each one a monument to the empire I was building. Because when the time came, and I knew it would, I wasn't just going to show them a car. I wasn't going to flash one symbol of success and let them dismiss it as luck or timing. No, I was going to show them the full scope of what I had become in a way they couldn't spin, couldn't laugh off, couldn't reduce to a joke at dinner. The rise wasn't just about money or status. It was about control. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to them. I wasn't scrambling to defend myself. I was moving deliberately, piece by piece, setting up a stage they didn't even know they'd be standing on. And when the curtain finally rose, they would find themselves not as the audience, but as the spectacle. The real turning point came on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where the sky looked heavy and the city moved slower than usual. I was in my office, glass walls reflecting a skyline blurred by drizzle, when my assistant walked in with a folder. "You'll want to see this," she said, sliding it across my desk. Inside were details about a new client. Except not just any client. It was the firm my dad had spent most of his career trying to impress. The one he'd always described as the pinnacle of the industry, the same company he used to wave around at dinner as proof of how close he was to greatness. And now they weren't just working with us, they were working directly under me. My signature was the one on the dotted line. I leaned back in my chair, staring at that folder. My dad had spent years measuring me against a standard I never asked to be measured by. He'd mock me for not getting there. And now here it was, his holy grail. Sitting in a folder on my desk with my name stamped across it. The irony was almost too perfect. But that wasn't the only thing. A week later, during a quarterly dinner hosted by the industry's top players, I overheard something that made my stomach tighten. My dad's reputation, the one he guarded like a crown, wasn't what it used to be. His firm was losing ground. Younger executives were circling like sharks, whispering about outdated strategies, poor leadership, missed opportunities. And in those whispers, one theme kept repeating: his time at the top was running out. That's when it clicked. All those little messages from my family, the sudden attempts to reel me back in, weren't just about reconnecting. They'd sniffed out something. Maybe they'd heard my name mentioned in circles they used to dominate. Maybe they noticed the silence and mistook it for arrogance. Either way, they had realized something was shifting, and they wanted in before it was too late. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I started gathering information quietly, carefully. Through mutual contacts, I learned that my dad's firm was bidding for a contract they desperately needed. Without it, they'd lose credibility, maybe even key investors. And guess whose firm was also on the short list for that same contract? Mine. When I first saw the email confirming it, I just sat there staring at the screen. Years of being mocked for chasing something unrealistic. Years of being told I was the failure, the dreamer. And now, without even trying, I was in a position to decide whether my dad's firm sank or swam. It wasn't just poetic. It was power. Real, tangible power. And once I had that in my hands, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I began laying the groundwork. I didn't tell anyone. Not my team, not my friends. I let the process play out naturally. Made sure our bid was strong, airtight, impossible to dismiss. Every detail was double-checked. Every presentation rehearsed to perfection. We weren't just competing. We were positioning ourselves as inevitable. Meanwhile, I stayed silent with my family. I ignored another dinner invitation, another friendly call from Mark, another text from Rachel that said, "Miss you. We should do something soon." I knew what they wanted, and I wasn't going to give them an inch until I was ready. But it wasn't only the contract that gave me leverage. Around that same time, I was invited to join a private circle of executives and investors, the kind of network where decisions were made before they ever hit the public. It was an inner ring my dad had dreamed of entering but never could. And suddenly I was in the room, shaking hands, trading stories, earning respect, not because of my last name, but because of what I'd built. I remember sitting at one of those meetings, a glass of scotch in my hand, listening to a conversation about upcoming mergers. Someone mentioned my firm as a rising power, heads nodded around the table. And in that moment, I felt something I'd never felt before. Not just pride, not just vindication, but certainty. Certainty that I had crossed a line I could never be pushed back from. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I wasn't just proving them wrong. I was standing on ground they could never reach. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized the real revenge wasn't just going to be about showing them my success. It was about letting them walk straight into it, thinking they were in control, only to realize they'd been standing on my stage all along. The setup was complete. I had the contract. I had the network. I had the silence driving them mad with curiosity. All I needed now was the right moment to pull the curtain back. And as fate would have it, that moment arrived sooner than I expected. It happened on a Saturday evening, the kind of night my family loved to orchestrate. An important dinner at a private club they'd been members of for decades. It was one of those places with heavy oak doors, white tablecloths, and a maitre d' who looked at everyone like they were auditioning for permission to belong. Mom called it a family tradition when she extended the invitation, but I knew better. They wanted to parade Mark's newest promotion, Rachel's Paris escapades, and Dad's enduring reputation, all while setting me up for the usual role of silent spectator. I almost didn't go, but then I thought about the timing. My firm had just been announced as the official recipient of that massive contract. Yes, the very one my dad's company had been clinging to as their lifeline. The news hadn't fully trickled down yet, but within days it would be public. And here they were, inviting me back into their spotlight. The stage wasn't just set. It was practically begging me to step on it. So I accepted. When I arrived, the evening began predictably. Dad was at the head of the table, glass raised, booming voice filling the room with tales of his industry prowess. Mark sat beside him, nodding eagerly, occasionally chiming in with his own accomplishments. Rachel was draped in some designer dress, scrolling on her phone until she felt the need to chime in with a casual, "Oh, in Paris, we did this." And Mom, of course, smiled approvingly at each of them, turning the spotlight on me only when she wanted to draw out another round of subtle jabs. "Carl," she said sweetly after the appetizers had been cleared. "We never did see that roles you mentioned. You must forgive us for doubting, but you do have a tendency to exaggerate." She let the word linger, as if she were sprinkling seasoning onto the table. Mark leaned forward, smirking. Maybe he left it at the dealership again. Rachel giggled, twirling her wine glass. Or maybe it's like that job he said he had once. Remember how that turned out? The table erupted in laughter. And for a moment, I just sat there, letting the sound wash over me like I had so many times before. But this time, I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't swallowing my pride. I was waiting for the exact moment to turn their stage into mine. When the laughter died down, Dad leaned in, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Carl, listen, enough games. If you really have something going, it's time to show it. Your family needs you. My firm needs a boost right now. You could finally prove yourself useful." I looked at him steadily, my expression unreadable. "Funny you mentioned that, Dad," I said, my tone calm, almost casual. "Because I heard your firm was banking pretty heavily on that upcoming contract with Harrow and Company." His face stiffened, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. "It's confidential," he said quickly. "How would you even?" I leaned back, smiling faintly. "Because they signed with us." The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard from them. No laughter, no smirking, just stillness. Rachel blinked at me, confused. Mark's jaw tightened, his smirk gone. Mom's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. And Dad just stared, his eyes narrowing as if he could will the words back into my mouth. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I just let the truth sit there, heavy and undeniable. Finally, Mom broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Us? You mean your firm?" "Yes," I said simply. "We closed the deal last week. They're shifting everything over to us. It'll be announced on Monday." Dad's face turned a shade I'd never seen before, somewhere between pale and livid. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. Rachel's phone slipped from her fingers onto the table with a dull thud. I leaned forward, resting my elbows lightly on the table. You've spent years telling me I was the failure, the dreamer, the one who never measured up. And while you were laughing, mocking, and dismissing me, I was building something bigger than all of you combined. Now, the company you've been bragging about for decades, the one you pinned your reputation on, chose me, not you, not your firm, me. The words weren't shouted, but they struck harder than any raised voice could. And watching their faces, watching the weight of reality settle on them, was more satisfying than I ever imagined. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Because as I sat back, calm and collected, I knew this wasn't just about the contract. This was about showing them once and for all that the roles had reversed. I wasn't the one sitting at their table begging for approval anymore. They were sitting at mine, whether they realized it or not. And I had one more move to make that would seal it completely. The silence at that table stretched so long I could hear the faint clink of cutlery from other diners across the room. My family, always so loud, so sure of themselves, looked small for the first time in my life. Dad was the first to speak, though his voice had lost its booming confidence. This isn't possible. Harrow and Company has been with us for decades. They wouldn't just. He stopped, his words strangling in his throat, because he knew it was possible. He knew exactly why they would walk away. Because his firm had grown stale while mine was thriving. Mark leaned forward, desperate. Carl, listen. Maybe this doesn't have to be a competition. We could work together, merge our firms even. With my experience and your lucky break, we could really, I raised a hand, cutting him off. It's not a lucky break, Mark. It's years of work you never saw because you were too busy laughing at me. My voice was steady, calm, the way I'd always wished it could be in those moments they tore me down. Rachel's eyes glistened, her voice pitched higher than usual. Carl, you don't mean to just leave us out, do you? We're family. You know how much I've always supported you. Supported me? I asked, tilting my head. By mocking me at every turn? By treating me like a joke at Christmas? No, Rachel, you didn't support me. You drained me. And now you're only reaching out because you see something you want. Mom finally spoke, her voice trembling, but her words sharp as ever. Carl, you can't just turn your back on us. After everything we've done for you, I laughed quietly, shaking my head. Everything you've done to me, you mean? You mocked me when I was struggling. You paraded my failures in front of strangers. You only called when you thought I had something to give you. That's not family. That's exploitation. Their faces fell one by one. A slow collapse of the facade they had always worn. The smugness drained from Mark. The superiority bled from Dad. Even Mom's carefully cultivated composure cracked, her lips trembling as if she could no longer find the right script. I stood, placing my napkin neatly on the table. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. I looked at them, really looked at them for the first time, not as the family who had broken me down, but as people who no longer had any power over me. You asked why you haven't seen the roles, I said, my voice clear and steady. It's because I don't need to prove anything to you. But since you're so curious, I gestured toward the window. Outside, under the club's lantern lights, the Rolls-Royce waited at the curb. My driver stood by the door, polished and poised, the emblem gleaming like a quiet truth. Gasps came from the neighboring tables. Heads turned. My family's faces went pale. There was no denying it now. I leaned down slightly, just enough to meet their eyes. This is the last time I let you humiliate me. The next time you think of me as the family joke, remember this. The joke's on you. Then I turned and walked out, the hush of the dining room broken only by the soft click of my shoes against the marble floor. The maitre d' opened the door as if he'd been waiting just for me. My driver bowed slightly, pulling the door of the Rolls open. I slid inside without looking back. As the car pulled away, I caught one final glimpse through the tinted glass. My father slumped in his chair, my mother clutching at her pearls, my brother staring in disbelief, and my sister wiping at her eyes. The empire they had built on mocking me had crumbled in a single evening. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. I didn't just rise above them. I left them behind. What about you? Have you ever had to cut ties with people who constantly brought you down, even if they were family? How did you find the strength to do it? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to hear your stories.